Angela looked like she was dying. Bald, pale, too weak to lift a coffee mug. She told me she had 2 weeks left. So I showed up at her oncology center with lunch, hoping to surprise her. The nurse gave me a strange look when I said her name. "I'm sorry, sir. We don't have any patient by that name." I stood there, frozen, holding a sandwich and flowers, while my wife, who I had watched waste away for 2 years, suddenly stopped existing on every medical record. My name is Ethan Morris. I'm 37 years old. I teach American history at a high school just outside Philadelphia. I've always believed in doing the right thing, even when it's hard. I married for love. I stayed loyal. I supported my wife through every late-night fever and panic attack, or so I thought. Angela and I had been married for 6 years when she told me she had cancer. Something rare. Complicated. Her voice shook when she said it. She didn't cry, but I did. I held her on the kitchen floor while dinner burned in the oven, promising her we'd fight it together. That same week, I took family leave from my job. She insisted on handling things quietly. No social media announcements, no pity posts, just us. But the bills piled up fast. She said insurance wouldn't cover the experimental treatment. Out-of-network specialists. Custom chemo blends. So I remortgaged our home. Cashed out my savings. Set up a fundraiser and watched the donations roll in from friends, coworkers, even strangers. We raised over 50, zero in 6 weeks. And every cent went into an account she managed. I didn't ask questions. I trusted her. Angela started losing weight. She shaved her head. She came home from treatment, exhausted, shivering under a blanket, too weak to eat. I rubbed her back through the nausea, held her hair while she vomited into the toilet. I told her she was strong, that we were going to beat this. But now I stood in a clinic where she was supposed to be receiving chemo, and the nurse was looking at me like I'd lost my mind. "We don't have anyone named Angela Morris," she repeated. "Are you sure she's supposed to be here?" I managed to nod. "She comes here every Wednesday and Friday." The nurse frowned, typing again. "Sir, I've worked here for 7 years. If she were a regular patient, I'd know." My stomach dropped. The room suddenly felt too bright, too sterile. "Is it possible she goes to another location? A partner clinic?" She shook her head. "No, we're independent. We don't have other sites." I thanked her and walked back out to my car in silence, gripping the paper bag of soup that was still warm in my hands. I sat in the driver's seat and stared at the dashboard. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there silent, still while the truth began to sink in. Angela wasn't here. Angela had never been here. And in that moment, something in me snapped. Have you ever trusted someone so completely, only to realize it was all a lie? If your partner faked cancer to steal from you, would you forgive them or fight back? Tell me what you would have done in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Revenge with Max for more jaw-dropping betrayal stories like this one every single day. I didn't go home right away. I drove aimlessly for over an hour, looping around the city in a daze. I kept looking at the lunch bag beside Meth, soup getting cold, the flowers wilting in the passenger seat and feeling like an idiot. A fool in love. A husband who gave everything to someone who didn't even exist the way he thought she did. By the time I walked through our front door, Angela was already on the couch, curled under a gray blanket with the lights off, and a show paused on the TV. She looked up with tired eyes, her voice a whisper. "You're home early. What happened to your last class?" I stared at her, her pale skin, the beanie covering her bald head, the mug of ginger tea resting on the coffee table like some kind of costume prop. "Yeah," I said flatly. "Class got canceled." She gave a soft smile. "That's lucky. I've been feeling really sick after this session. They changed my meds again." I nodded and walked to the kitchen. My jaw clenched so tight it hurt. I set the bag of untouched soup on the counter and stared at the wall for a long time. I didn't sleep that night. I waited until Angela started snoring softly, then went into the guest room with my laptop. I opened every browser tab I could think of, every oncology clinic within 30 miles, every doctor she'd ever mentioned. I called 3 after-hours hotlines pretending to be a concerned relative, asking about a patient named Angela Morris. One of the operators gently said, "I'm sorry, sir. We've never treated anyone by that name." My heart beat like a drum in my throat. The next morning, I watched Angela leave for her Friday session. She wore her usual oversized hoodie, a knit hat, and carried the canvas tote with crossword puzzles and ginger chews. She kissed me on the cheek and said, "Wish me luck, baby." I did, but not before I slipped out 15 minutes after her. I followed her. She didn't go to the oncology center. She didn't go to any clinic. Angela drove across the city and pulled into the parking lot of a strip mall. I parked at a distance and watched her walk casually into a salon. A salon. A nail salon, to be exact. 20 minutes later, she emerged with a fresh manicure, smiling and texting on her phone. No limp, no nausea, no sign of the woman who'd curled up moaning just the night before. I took a photo through my windshield, then another. Then I started the engine and drove away, chest hollow, head pounding. Back home, she returned around noon and gave me the usual story. "Treatment was hard today. I think I'll nap for a bit." She shuffled to the bedroom and shut the door. I sat at the kitchen table in silence, staring at the photos on my phone. She wasn't sick. She'd never been sick. And somehow, that realization hurt more than if she'd simply said she wanted to leave me. Over the next 2 days, I went through everything. Bank statements, donation records, medical receipts, what little she'd printed out. And the cracks started showing. Transfers from our joint account to a secondary one under her name. Thousands pulled from the fundraiser to a card I didn't know existed. No prescription labels, no appointment confirmations, no test results. Just vague notes she'd scribbled in a notebook. Fake symptom charts, meaningless scribbles. I reached out to an old friend from college who worked as a private investigator. I didn't give many details. I just said I needed to know what my wife was doing and whether she was planning to disappear. He didn't ask questions. He just got to work. 3 days later, I had my answer. Angela had been renting a small apartment under a fake name in another state lease starting in 2 weeks. She'd used the alias Abigail Green. The same week she told me her cancer had entered the final stage and that she'd be going away for intensive care in a clinical trial. The investigator also uncovered that she'd been transferring money into a third bank account, one I'd never seen, linked to the same fake identity. That account already had over $230,000 in it. Everything we'd raised, everything I'd mortgaged, every ounce of trust I'd poured into her. Angela was preparing to vanish. And if I hadn't shown up at that clinic when I did, she would have, without a word, without a trace. I closed the report folder and sat in my car for a long time, listening to the sound of my own breath. I wasn't just betrayed. I was robbed. And the woman who did it was sleeping in my bed pretending to die, while planning a brand new life with stolen money and a new name. And that's when the idea began to form, not just to confront her, but to make sure everyone she fooled knew exactly who she really was. The next morning, I acted like nothing had changed. Angela made her usual slow shuffle from the bedroom, wrapped in her blanket, sipping peppermint tea like she'd spent the night battling chemo-induced nausea. I kissed her forehead and asked if she wanted scrambled eggs. She smiled faintly and whispered, "Only if they're extra soft today." I cooked them, sat with her, watched her nibble half a bite, sigh dramatically and say, "Everything just tastes metallic now." Side effect of the drugs. It was almost impressive, the way she slipped into her performance without missing a beat. If I hadn't known what I knew, I would have believed every word. But now, every movement felt like theater. Every cough, every wince, every weary sigh. All of it carefully choreographed. I didn't confront her. I didn't scream. I started building my plan. That evening, after she went to bed early like she often did, exhausted from the injections, she claimed I sent out a dozen emails from a fresh account I'd created, truthaboutangela@protonmail.com. Each message was addressed to someone who'd donated to her fundraiser, her childhood friend who'd wired 20 my colleague at school who'd organized the charity run, the woman from our old apartment building who sent cards every month with hand-drawn sunflowers. I didn't accuse Angela directly. I simply wrote, "This may come as a shock, but if you donated to Angela Morris's medical fundraiser, you deserve to know that no record exists of her being treated at any oncology clinic in the region. I've spent the last 2 weeks verifying everything, and what I found doesn't add up." I attached a copy of the PI's summary, just enough to raise questions, enough to plant seeds. The responses began trickling in within hours. Some were confused. Some were furious. One woman replied with, "I knew something felt off. She never wanted to talk about her treatment. Thank you for telling me." By the end of the week, I had over 40 replies. People who once rallied around Angela, now demanding answers. Meanwhile, Angela continued her act, completely unaware that her illusion was beginning to unravel. Then came the final piece. I told her I wanted to throw her a dinner party. Just a small one, to celebrate her strength. A thank you to the people who supported us through this impossible journey. Her eyes welled with tears. "You're amazing," she whispered. "I just want people to know how brave you've been," I said softly, pressing my lips to her hand. She nodded and smiled, moved by the gesture. "We can do it next Saturday." Perfect. Over the next few days, I printed documents, bank statements, donation reports, photos from the salon, the rental lease under the name Abigail Green. I prepared a slideshow, subtle but damning designed, not for courtroom drama, but for personal devastation. Saturday arrived. Angela wore a soft blue dress, wrapped her fake sickly figure in a shawl, and painted on just enough blush to look alive. "You look beautiful," I said, and meant it in the coldest way possible. Our guests arrived, slowly 12 in total. Her best friend from college, her yoga instructor, my boss, her mother, her uncle. Every person in that room had sent money, gifts, time, love. We sat around the dinner table. I toasted to Angela, spoke of bravery, sacrifice, hope. She cried. Then I said, "But before dessert, there's something I need to share with all of you." The room quieted. Angela looked at me, puzzled, still smiling. I picked up the remote and clicked the projector to life. The first slide appeared. A photo of her entering the nail salon, smiling. Time-stamped the day of her chemo. Slide 2. Bank statements showing donation transfers to an unknown account. Slide 3. Her lease agreement under the name Abigail Green. Then, the email from the oncology clinic confirming she was never a patient. The silence was crushing. Angela stared at the screen, frozen. Everyone else turned to look at her. No one said a word. Until her mother whispered, "Angela, is this true?" Angela's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her uncle stood up. "Is this some kind of joke?" I turned to them calmly. "It's not a joke, and it's not a misunderstanding. Angela never had cancer. Not one appointment. Not one prescription. The woman you see here lied to every single one of you for 2 years. Angela shot up from her seat. "Ethan, what are you doing?" I looked at her, my voice steady. "What you were never expecting, Angela. The truth." She stormed from the room, shaking, her fake weak legs suddenly working just fine. Behind me, the people she deceived were silent. Some shocked, some pale with rage, some crying. Angela hadn't just betrayed me. She'd betrayed a whole village of love and support. And now, every mask she'd worn for 2 years had cracked wide open. And I wasn't done yet. Angela locked herself in the bedroom for the rest of the night. She didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't try to explain. She just shut the door and vanished behind it like she had behind her sickness. But this time, the curtain had been ripped away, and there was no performance left to hide behind. Our guests left quietly, some without even looking at me. Her mother stayed behind, stunned, whispering, "How could she? How could anyone?" Over and over. I didn't answer. I just poured her a glass of water and walked her to the door. By midnight, the apartment was silent again. And that's when Angela finally came out. She stood in the hallway, wrapped in her shawl, but there was no sickness in her eyes now, only fury. "You humiliated me," she hissed. I looked at her calmly. "You lied. For 2 years. To me. To everyone. I had no choice." That made me laugh. Not loud, not angry, just bitter. No choice? You could have told the truth. You could have asked for help. But you didn't. You staged an illness. You drained our bank accounts. You scammed people who loved you. Her hands were shaking now. "You don't understand what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like your life isn't going anywhere. I just wanted control. I just wanted something that made people care." I stared at her, numb. "So you faked cancer." "I never meant for it to go that far," she said, her voice cracking. "I thought maybe it would end after a few months. But the donations kept coming. The sympathy, the attention. I didn't know how to stop." "And what about the apartment in Vermont?" I asked. "What about the name Abigail Green? What about the new life you were planning next month while telling me you had weeks to live?" Angela blinked. The silence was answer enough. "You weren't going to die," I said quietly. "You were going to disappear." She looked down. Then she whispered, "You were never supposed to find out." The words hit harder than anything else she'd said. I didn't yell. I didn't break anything. I just turned around and walked to my office. I closed the door, and I started writing. Emails to the bank, to the fundraiser platforms, to our mutual friends, to the investigative journalist I'd contacted 2 days earlier. I sent the slideshow, the proof, the timeline, the audio clip I'd secretly recorded during our conversation where she admitted to faking the illness. It was all going public now, not out of revenge. Out of principle. Out of justice. Angela had played the role of a dying woman long enough. It was time the world saw her as what she really was. By Sunday morning, the story had already started to spread. One of the donors had forwarded the email chain to a local news outlet. By noon, a reporter had reached out to confirm the details. By evening, it was on Facebook. Philadelphia woman accused of faking terminal cancer, scamming over $200,000 in donations. The article included a blurry photo of Angela from the fundraiser pager, with a scarf around her head, smiling faintly into the camera. The headline didn't even need drama. The facts were enough to ignite rage. Angela's phone exploded with messages, calls, comments. Her social media flooded with disbelief, then hate. The next day, she received a call from the fundraising platform. Her account was frozen. Then the bank called. Then the police. When I came home that afternoon, she was sitting on the couch with her head in her hands. "You ruined my life," she said without looking up. "No," I said, walking past her. "You did that yourself. I just made sure everyone saw it." Angela tried to spin it, of course, said it was a mental health crisis, that she'd been overwhelmed, that she'd never actually spent the money, just kept it safe. But the paper trail said otherwise. Plane tickets, rental agreements, transactions to luxury retailers, and most damning of all, a printed itinerary for a one-way flight to Montreal, booked under the name Abigail Green. For the following week, I watched as the fallout crashed down around her like a collapsing stage set. Her job? Gone. Her reputation? Shredded. Her relationships? Vanished. Even her parents stopped answering her calls. I stayed in the apartment a little longer, sleeping in the guest room, saying nothing. I needed to watch the final act play out. I needed to make sure she didn't twist this into another performance. Then, one afternoon, a detective knocked on our door. Angela opened it. He asked for her by full name. She didn't resist. She didn't cry. She just nodded. And when the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, she finally looked at me. There was no hatred in her eyes. No fury. Just shame. She said nothing. And I didn't either. The door closed behind them. And I sat down in the living room, breathing the first full breath I'd taken in 2 years. Angela was charged with multiple counts of fraud, including wire fraud, charitable solicitation fraud, and identity deception. The state launched an investigation within 48 hours of her arrest. And by the end of the week, the story had made national news. She was no longer just Angela Morris, my wife. She was the cancer con artist of Pennsylvania. A journalist from a local station tried to interview me outside my school. I declined, but the questions didn't stop. Emails flooded my inbox. People asking how I hadn't known. Others thanking me for exposing the truth. A few even blaming me for believing her lies. But I didn't respond. I kept my head down and my mouth shut. I wasn't interested in attention. I was interested in consequences. Meanwhile, more than 80 donors came forward with official complaints. One of them, a retired veteran who had sent his entire tax refund to Angela's fundraiser, became the face of the victims in court filings. I watched the press conference on TV as he clutched a photograph of his late wife who had died of leukemia just last year. "She played on people's grief," he said, his voice shaking. "She played on mine." That's when the civil suit started. Angela's accounts were frozen, her assets seized. My home, the home I'd mortgaged to fund her treatment, was now tangled in legal red tape. The apartment she rented under her fake name, vacated, locked, sealed by investigators. Her lawyer tried for a plea deal, claimed mental illness, stress disorder, dissociation. The prosecution didn't buy it. Neither did I. And yet, I didn't want to watch her rot in a prison cell. Not because I pitied her, but because prison would have let her vanish behind bars quietly, anonymously, without ever facing the people she hurt. So I offered something else. Through my attorney, I submitted a proposal to the DA's office. If Angela wanted any leniency at all, she would have to attend a public restitution hearing, a chance for every person she deceived to stand in a courtroom and speak. Not for the court, not for the judge, but for her. To look her in the eye and ask, why? To hear the silence she could no longer fake her way out of. To watch the weight of what she did sink in without makeup, without filters, without stage lighting. To my surprise, the DA agreed. And so did Angela. The hearing was scheduled for a Friday in June. The courtroom was packed. Over 100 people filled the pews. Friends, neighbors, strangers who had followed her story online. Angela entered in a beige prison jumpsuit, no wig, no beanie, just her, pale, thin, quiet, but not sick. This time it was real. One by one, they stood. A teacher who donated her weekend tutoring income. A teenage girl who shaved her head in solidarity after watching Angela's viral video. An elderly woman who wrote monthly checks from her fixed income and cried as she asked, "How could you do this to people who believed in you?" Angela didn't speak. She didn't interrupt. She didn't cry. She sat motionless, head bowed, as voice after voice stripped her lies away. And when it was my turn, I didn't bring notes. I didn't prepare a speech. I just walked to the front and looked at her. "You lied to me," I said. "Every day, for 2 years. You stole my time, my money, my trust. You told me you were dying, and I loved you through every fake symptom, every fake breakdown, every fake goodbye." She didn't look up. "But the worst part," I continued, "is that when I finally found out, when I finally saw who you were, I didn't even feel hate. I felt empty, like I'd been loving a ghost." The courtroom was silent. "You didn't just break hearts, Angela. You used them." I stepped down. Angela never said a word. Not that day. Not in court. Not to the people who deserved it most. But the sentence spoke for her. 18 months in state custody. Mandatory restitution of over $185,000. And 5 years probation after release, during which she could never legally participate in or solicit for any fundraiser of any kind. She was taken away in silence. And that was that. Almost. The day Angela was sentenced, I walked out of the courthouse and kept walking. No destination, no plan, just movement. For the first time in over 2 years, I didn't feel like a caregiver, a husband, or a fool. I felt like a man coming back from something, not war, not disaster, something slower, quieter. A long lie. stretched thin over my life like a weighted blanket I hadn't realized was suffocating me. That evening, I packed a duffel bag and checked into a cheap hotel on the edge of town. Not because I had nowhere to go, but because I needed to remember what silence sounded like when it wasn't full of worry. The news followed me anyway. Every local outlet covered Angela's sentencing. A few national ones picked it up too. Wife faked terminal cancer to fund secret life. Husband exposes 2-year scam. The headlines didn't bother me anymore. They weren't about me. Not really. Angela had become a symbol of betrayal, of trust shattered, and of what happens when you push good people too far. But in the background, something unexpected was unfolding. Emails started showing up in my inbox, not from reporters this time, but from strangers, people from Ohio, Arizona, even as far as New Zealand, men and women who had gone through similar betrayals. Some were partners of addicts. Others had been conned by family members. Some just needed to say, "I thought I was crazy too." I read every message. And slowly, the guilt I didn't even know I carried began to lift. I hadn't been blind. I had been loyal. That distinction mattered more than I expected. A few weeks later, I received a call from the woman who ran the local cancer charity Angela had partnered with early on. She said the nonprofit had received hundreds of new donations after the case broke. People gave not just out of sympathy, but out of rage, wanting to reclaim the goodness Angela had tried to twist. "We'd like to name a support grant in your name," she said, "for caregivers, people like you." I almost said no. Then I thought about all those nights I'd held Angela's hand, thinking I was fighting for someone's life, not knowing she was quietly planning to leave mine. "Yeah," I said finally, "let's do it." The Ethan Morris Resilience Grant launched 2 months later. Small money, modest beginnings, but it was something real. No lies, no stolen sympathy, just help, quietly given to people who needed it. By fall, I'd sold the apartment we once shared, took a teaching job in a new school, bought a 1-bedroom house in a quiet part of town with a small yard, a dog I named Truman, and no reminders of the life I left behind. I still get messages from old friends, sometimes people who can't believe what happened. "Do you ever miss her?" one asked me recently. I paused before answering. "I don't miss her," I replied. "I miss the version of her I believed in. And I miss who I was when I believed in her. That part of me, the one that loved blindly, that trusted without needing proofs, gone now. Not bitter, just wiser. And maybe that's what survival really looks like. Not revenge, not justice in a courtroom. Just quiet, just peace. Just never falling for the same lie twice." It's been over a year since Angela was sentenced. She's still serving time. Last I heard, some minimum security facility upstate. She sends letters sometimes. 3 so far. I haven't opened a single one. They sit in a drawer beneath old tax forms and expired insurance cards. Unread, unanswered. Because the truth is, I don't need closure from her. I already got it. Not in the courtroom. Not from the headlines. But in the silence that followed. I've learned that some wounds don't close with apologies. They close with distance, with time, with the decision to stop bleeding for someone who wouldn't even flinch watching you fall apart. I'm not angry anymore. I don't walk around with bitterness in my chest or grief in my throat. I just live, day by day. I wake up early. I teach history. I take Truman on walks through the quiet parts of town. I cook dinner for one and light a candle anyway. There's a kind of peace in solitude I never understood before all this. And every once in a while, someone still reaches out, someone who read the article or saw the video clip. They say things like, "I thought I was the only one," or "Thank you for standing up when I couldn't." And I tell them the truth. I didn't feel brave. I didn't have a plan. I just reached a point where the lie hurt more than the fallout ever could. And I chose truth. That's it. I don't know what Angela tells herself now. Maybe that she made a mistake. Maybe that she deserved the money. Maybe that I was cruel for exposing her. But I know what I tell myself. That I survived something hollow wearing the mask of love. That I walked through a 2-year performance and came out on the other side without becoming someone I'd hate. and that's enough. So no, I don't need revenge anymore. I have something better. My life, my peace, and a quiet promise to never let anyone write my story for me again. What did you think of this story? If you were in Ethan's shoes, would you have exposed Angela or walked away silently? Let me know in the comments. And if you stand with Ethan, type 1. If not, type 7. Don't forget to subscribe to Revenge with Max so you never miss a powerful new karma story every single day.